I'm with Mark Warne Smith, who's a political military liaison officer for the UN, helping get humanitarian assistance where it needs to be.
Good morning, Dan.
Thank you. So, Mark, can you talk to us about what your role in the UN is today?
I can. First of all, I'm not a humanitarian civil military liaison. My role is with a humanitarian organisation, the World Food Programme, currently assigned to the logistics cluster. And in emergencies where there's a military presence, either rapid onset disasters like an earthquake in Haiti or a typhoon, or complex emergencies like Syria or Yemen or Ebola, where there are military assets deployed or there's belligerent forces, humanitarian agencies need to be able to negotiate space to operate, and that's where I get involved.
So we often look at international crises and see the UN and the UN Security Council involved or not. How does the UN Security Council impact the work that you have to do?
Quite heavily. At the end of the day, the UN Security Council veto can stop any UN action, and a Security Council resolution can also enable action. It's not always negative. If you look at like an Ebola response, the resolution that was crafted enabled a regional response through the Ebola affected countries that enabled a lot more flexibility with the UN to respond. Most people typically think of UN Security Council as vetoes, a la Russia vetoing resolutions against Assad, or there's a long history of vetoes being used, and if they are implemented, then they can directly affect how things happen, whether there's a ceasefire, whether there's a withdrawal of belligerent forces.
Turning to the issue of human rights in the UN, about which a great deal is said and written, do these human rights principles actually have any positive material effect on the ground?
I don't deal directly with human rights, but the principles that apply, the international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles for delivery of aid, are very much akin, which is impartial and neutral response. We don't take sides in the belligerents. We help all people in need. The primacy of our focus is on people in need, the beneficiaries, and we also use the Hippocratic idea of do no harm. So our processes, our aid should not have any adverse effects. And I had a General Kennedy of the US Marine Corps who'd worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, many difficult places, and he'd initially complained about UN or international humanitarian principles, and at his retirement speech he was saying the principles are the only thing that enable you to do your work. And this is a guy who'd been a 3-star general in command of numerous responses in numerous conflicts, and had come to understand that the humanitarian agencies are not a means to implement a political agenda, but that the impartial helping of people in need according to a principled action was the most credible response the UN could make.
Well, talking more about responses, you're involved a lot in emergency responses under UN, with UN support under a UN mandate. Can you talk to us a bit from your experience about how the UN does respond to crises well and perhaps also not so well?
The UN is always invited by a country that's affected by disaster to participate. The UN is a political entity, and it's the product of their member states. So it's a fait accompli that the vested interests of the member states drive the help. If you look at, and this also goes to budget, so even if it's not Security Council, the larger UN agencies like the World Food Programme have their budget lines are principally from member state donations. 1 year, North Korea, the aid program there, where there are a lot of people starving, meeting the IPC classification of 4 or 5, which is extreme. There was substantial help, and then there was a failure to comply with the weapons program, and the next year all the funding was withdrawn, or not all the funding, but a significant portion of the funding was withdrawn from those feeding programs, and that's a political response. And that was not assessed according to the people suddenly were no longer in IPC 4 or 5. It was
IPC 4 or 5?
It's a classification of famine.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes from 1 to 5, and 4 to 5 is, if you think Somalia, Ethiopia,
Mm-hmm.
in the Bob Geldof days, that would have been a 5,
Mm-hmm.
just to give people some context.
Mm.
So that's an example of a humanitarian program being affected
Mm-hmm.
by a political imperative of a member of the Security Council, but also the principal donor. We have a situation in Yemen at the moment where there would be much better logistical solutions to taking food to a country where about 14 million people are in need. But because of the political considerations, i.e. coalition partners and countries that are not coalition partners, we might have to transship food through a hub like Djibouti, which results in a 3-month delay in shipping times.
Mm-hmm.
When we know quite well that to work out of Oman and some of the ports in Oman would involve maybe a 2-week turnaround. But because the money comes from the donors who are coalition members prosecuting a war in Yemen, we can't go against that. We are a political organisation that's the product of its member states. We're not independent like an MSF or an ICRC, where they have their own resources and they're not dependent. That budget, not only is it the Security Council and the political mandates, but it's also the budgeting of the humanitarian programs of the UN that are very susceptible to agendas. And to be fair, a lot of good work also gets done from these same donors, but in a conflict, it's very important for us to maintain our independence and impartiality. So in like a Yemen context, we're not just helping one side. We go to great lengths to speak to all parties to the conflict. This is something else that can put UN humanitarian organisations in jeopardy, because I can speak to someone who's from a prescribed organisation and the perception would be that I'm talking to a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
In some countries, I might suddenly find that I'm no longer allowed a visa because I spoke to someone that I would consider a local militia leader or the local political authority, and that local political authority, I need their consent to access. But in the back of my mind, I am, how does this impact the credibility of my organisation? How does this affect us with the donors? And what is my personal liability in these situations?
Grand. Are we all right with the sound?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Am I too quiet?
No, it's more the kids in the background.
Your voice is low. If you can raise it a little bit.
Yeah, I tend
that,
to swallow my words a bit, so if
But,
that's...
but this is all right.
Am I
yeah,
sort of
because I touch
hitting...
the level, so I don't get that.
You have,
noise.
okay, so if you speak up a bit, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's just, I only stopped because of the babble in the background. I wanted to make sure that we didn't have to do the whole thing again,
Is it sounding coherent?
as ever.
Oh, well.
I want to go back a little bit, Mark, to...
I tend to follow the rabbit down the hole a little bit with...
that's all right, that's all right.
Right.
I won't stop. It was important to have you say it. I wanted to rewind a little bit and talk to you. Mark, I want to ask you about the Western approaches to humanitarian ideals and principles, because there's an idea around that human rights principles are just Western, and that as the West turns its back on humanitarian principles, you can really forget all about them, because the rest of the world doesn't really believe in these sort of humanitarian human rights principles. What's your reaction to that? It's quite fashionable amongst some academics, for example.
I'm terrified by the idea of humanitarian rights being wound back.
But you don't. But do you see it as simply a Western construction?
I do see it as a product of democratic ways of government, in terms of a democracy is constructed with consent of the people, and there's always a debate about people that are disenfranchised, and I see, my personal opinion is that human rights came from that process. In that I would say yes, but the ownership of those ideas are no longer exclusively Western at all, and there are many countries that go to great efforts that I can see continuous movements towards human rights. A classic example is, for me, Indonesia. The military in Indonesia 40, 50 years ago was self-funded through its own business enterprises, and over the last 30 years my understanding is that the Indonesian military is now funded directly from the government budget, that it's no longer self-sustaining. I see that as a good separation of powers, an improvement in the democratic process, and I've been to many countries where it's very tough to be a human rights campaigner or to investigate human rights abuses, and I've met many brave people who have nothing to do with Western institutions, who work tirelessly at human rights. I can't imagine any of these people that I've met suddenly giving up on that, and their courage is to be applauded.
Okay, well, moving on to looking into our crystal ball and thinking about the future of the UN. First of all, how do you see in your field the UN developing? Has it been a positive progression so far? And have you any ideas yourself as to how things might practically be improved? And as academics, we can come up with lots of theoretical ideas, but all too often these fall short of the pragmatic test of can they actually work. So do tell us what your own thinking is.
So I see three parts to that. The first, has the UN improved? Yes, it has, and it has, but has it improved quick enough would be a different question. I look at militaries and the history of militaries since organised standing armies started 1,000 odd years ago, and there's been a history of errors. If you look at classic military disasters, for the want of a nail, for the want of a horse, simple command issues, simple HR issues that the military didn't resolve, and battles were lost, the militaries have had a millennia to improve their practices, and even they were drawing on Greek and Roman concepts. The UN's been around for 60 years, and the difference between what was happening, well, it's 75 years officially, give or take on, but the various humanitarian organisations along the way have been created for not much more than 50 years, and there has been a cycle of improvement. I would like if it happened more quickly. Some of the constraints are simple things like budget and resources. We don't have a lot of people. We tend to have one person doing a lot of functions in many areas, and replacing people, there tends to not be institutionalised practice. One of the problems is personalities are a big factor in responses. I've often found a certain agency in one country appalling, and I think this agency is hopeless, I never want to deal with them again. And I go to the next country and they're rock stars and they're working very effectively. And the only denominator that I can see in that is the personalities involved. The personalities involved.
Sure.
So,
I'm thinking about the future of the UN structures and UN reform.
I can only really speak to humanitarian reform, and there has already been some substantial reform with the cluster system, which is, there are various sectors of humanitarian activity. It might be shelter, water and sanitation, which we call WASH, the medical sector, logistics, and this generally works in terms of, it's less about the individual organisation focusing on getting its name out there, although that's a fierce competition, and it's become more about gap fit analysis within the clusters. All the parties to the food cluster, for instance, are much better at identifying the problems and the needs in a specific response and allocating those, reducing duplication of effort.
Mhm.
Even non-UN agencies and NGOs under the cluster system have been able to work much more closely. So, for instance, the logistics cluster has over 40 partners, and we might have fierce criticism from an Oxfam or an MSF about what the UN has done, but we will sit down at the table, discuss the problems and agree on a common response. This doesn't make the media. The thing that will make the media is independent NGO organisations saying the UN is terrible, and that will become a headline, where the reality is on the ground with the problem and the people who are working directly on the problem and interacting with the beneficiaries. Even though they might not like each other sometime, we're still talking, and there is still a quite coordinated effort amongst people who respond.
Well, thinking of talking and responses, what about the Security Council? Is there any hope there?
Why would a country give up its P5 veto? The Security Council, I can't see any of the permanent five giving up their veto power. And I see it as the area most in need of reform because it's the most sort of anti-democratic feature of the UN. But at the same time, when you look at the League of Nations, Russia left because it wasn't satisfied.
Germany left.
Germany left, and keeping people at the table, keeping any sort of dialogue still helps. And I also am a great believer that that venue for talking with the Security Council has, not all of this can be played out in public. If the question was, what role does the media play in this? It would be the media. People are always more willing to make concessions when they can have a dialogue with someone easily. If people are communicating via the media and through press releases, I don't see the negotiation ever going as well.
Right.
So there will always be that place for the Security Council and those backroom discussions. And this is not a sinister thing, it's just the nature of how people communicate and how concessions can be made, accommodations, which is the nature of politics.
Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.